What if the human mind could be turned into a weapon? During the darkest years of the Cold War, this question was not science fiction. Inside the secret world of American intelligence, officials were seriously asking whether drugs, hypnosis, isolation, fear, and psychological pressure could be used to influence human behavior. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle. Nuclear weapons threatened to destroy entire cities, spies operated behind enemy lines, and both sides feared that the other possessed secret technologies capable of changing the course of history. But there was another fear: brainwashing. American intelligence officials had heard disturbing reports about prisoners of war and psychological conditioning. Some believed that communist governments had developed techniques capable of breaking a person's resistance and manipulating their behavior. How much of those reports was actually true was uncertain. But during the Cold War, uncertainty itself could be dangerous. The CIA wanted answers. Could a person's memory be altered? Could drugs make someone more willing to talk? Could hypnosis influence behavior? Could extreme isolation break down a person's psychological defenses? And most importantly, could the human mind be controlled? In 1953, the CIA officially created a secret program called MKUltra. The program would eventually become one of the most controversial intelligence operations in American history. It was not a single experiment. MKUltra was an umbrella program containing numerous research projects. Different scientists and institutions were involved, often through complicated funding arrangements designed to hide the CIA's role. One of the central figures was Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist who became deeply involved in research into drugs and behavioral modification. The program explored a wide range of techniques. Some researchers investigated hypnosis. Others examined sensory deprivation. Some studied sleep disruption and psychological pressure. But one substance attracted enormous attention: LSD. At the time, LSD was still poorly understood. It could dramatically alter perception, mood, memory, and a person's sense of reality. To intelligence officials, that made it potentially valuable. They wanted to know whether LSD could make interrogation easier. Could it cause someone to reveal information? Could it make a person more vulnerable to suggestion? Could it disrupt memory? Could it create confusion? The problem was that the effects of LSD were unpredictable. One person might experience fascination or euphoria. Another might experience terror and extreme psychological distress. And there was an even bigger problem. Some people were given the drug without knowing it. That meant they could not give informed consent. One of the most disturbing examples involved secret CIA-linked safe houses. The most famous became associated with an operation later known as Operation Midnight Climax. In these locations, unsuspecting people were sometimes brought into rooms where they were secretly given LSD while observers watched from concealed areas. The people being observed did not know they were part of an intelligence experiment. Imagine suddenly feeling reality change around you without understanding why. Your thoughts become strange. Your perception changes. Time feels different. You become frightened. And somewhere nearby, people are watching and recording what happens. For the observers, it was research. For the subject, it could feel like losing control of reality itself. But LSD was only one part of the program. The CIA also investigated hypnosis. Researchers wanted to understand whether hypnotic suggestion could influence a person's behavior or memory. They explored whether hypnosis could potentially be combined with drugs or other psychological techniques. But human beings were not simple machines. There was no reliable method that allowed someone to completely control another person's mind. The science was uncertain. The results were inconsistent. Yet the experiments continued. Another area of interest was sensory deprivation. The basic idea was simple. Remove normal stimulation from the human brain. Reduce light. Reduce sound. Limit movement. Separate the person from normal social interaction. Under extreme conditions, people can lose their sense of time and experience severe psychological stress. Researchers wanted to know whether isolation could make someone more vulnerable during interrogation. Again, the question was not only whether the technique worked. The deeper question was whether researchers had the right to test it on human beings. That question became especially important because many subjects were vulnerable. Some were prisoners. Some were psychiatric patients. Some were members of the military. Others were ordinary civilians who had no idea they were being studied. The difference between voluntary research and secret experimentation is enormous. A person who knowingly joins an experiment can make an informed decision. A person who unknowingly receives a powerful drug has no choice at all. This is where the story of MKUltra becomes darker than the myths surrounding it. Popular culture often portrays mind control as a perfect technology, a machine that can transform someone into a programmable puppet. The historical evidence does not support that fantasy. MKUltra did not produce a magical formula for total mind control. But it did reveal something much more disturbing. Powerful institutions were willing to experiment with human psychology without proper consent in the hope of discovering such a method. One of the most tragic cases involved Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist. In 1953, Olson was secretly given LSD during a gathering involving CIA personnel. He later experienced serious psychological problems. Days afterward, he fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. The exact circumstances surrounding his death have remained controversial. But one fact is undeniable. He had been exposed to LSD without his knowledge. His story became one of the most powerful symbols of the dangers surrounding MKUltra. Another disturbing case involved Harold Blauer, who was receiving psychiatric treatment in New York. He was unknowingly given substances as part of secret government research. Blauer died after receiving repeated injections. His case later became part of the evidence showing how secret experimentation could occur within medical environments. These stories reveal the central problem with MKUltra. The people involved were not laboratory objects. They were human beings. They had families. They had careers. They had lives outside the experiment. And they often had no idea that their minds and bodies were being used for classified research. The CIA's secrecy made the situation even more complicated. Funding could be routed through organizations that appeared independent. Researchers could receive money without knowing the ultimate source. Different projects could be separated from one another. This made the entire operation difficult to understand. Even someone involved in one experiment might not know what the larger program looked like. That structure helped protect the program from exposure. And for years, it worked. MKUltra continued through the 1950s and 1960s, while the American public remained largely unaware of its existence. But the world around it was changing. The Vietnam War damaged public confidence in government. The Watergate scandal would later reveal how far political power could be abused. Journalists became more aggressive. Congress began questioning intelligence agencies more closely. And eventually, the secrets surrounding MKUltra started to escape. In the early 1970s, CIA leadership ordered the destruction of many MKUltra records. Thousands of documents disappeared. That decision would make it impossible to reconstruct the entire program. But not everything was destroyed. Some financial records survived, and those surviving documents would eventually help investigators discover just how extensive the program had been. The story was about to leave the classified world. Congress was going to investigate. The public was going to learn about secret drug experiments. And Americans were going to face a question that sounded almost unbelievable. Had the government really experimented on its own people? The answer was yes. And the evidence would reveal that MKUltra was not simply a strange Cold War experiment. It was a warning about what can happen when fear, secrecy, science, and unchecked power come together. Because the most frightening part of MKUltra was never the idea that the government had discovered perfect mind control. The most frightening part was that it was willing to search for it, even when innocent people could pay the price. For almost 2 decades, MKUltra remained hidden behind layers of secrecy. The American public knew little about it. Even many people inside the government had no idea how large the program had become. But behind closed doors, the CIA continued searching for ways to influence human behavior. The goal was not simply to discover a drug that would make someone talk. The dream was much bigger. Intelligence officials wanted to understand whether a person's thoughts, memories, emotions, and decisions could be manipulated. And the Cold War made that dream seem worth pursuing. The CIA believed that if America's enemies were experimenting with psychological manipulation, the United States could not afford to ignore the possibility. But there was a major problem. Human beings do not react to drugs and psychological pressure in predictable ways. A technique that affected one person might have almost no effect on another. A drug that produced calmness in one individual could produce panic in someone else. And instead of creating obedient subjects, some experiments created confusion, fear, paranoia, or psychological trauma. Still, the research continued. One of the most controversial areas involved secret LSD experiments. The CIA wanted to observe people under the influence of the drug without allowing them to prepare for the experience. That meant some subjects were given LSD without being told. The reasoning was that if people knew they were taking a drug, their expectations could influence the results. So the experiment had to remain secret. This created a dangerous contradiction. The more scientifically useful the experiment appeared to be, the less informed the subject could be. And without informed consent, the subject had no real control. Operation Midnight Climax became one of the most infamous examples. CIA-connected safe houses were established in places including San Francisco and New York. People were brought into these locations under ordinary circumstances. Some were secretly given LSD. Observers watched what happened. The setup was designed to imitate real-world conditions rather than a traditional laboratory. The CIA wanted to know how people behaved when they did not realize they were being studied. But this also meant that the subjects could not protect themselves. They did not know what they had consumed. They did not know who was watching. And they did not know why their perception was changing. The experiment was hidden from them from beginning to end. The deeper investigators later looked into MKUltra, the clearer it became that secrecy was not simply a side effect of the program. Secrecy was part of its structure. Money was often moved through organizations that appeared independent. Researchers could receive grants without being told that the CIA was ultimately behind them. This allowed the agency to support research while maintaining distance from the projects. For intelligence officials, this was useful. For the public, it created a serious accountability problem. If something went wrong, who was responsible? The scientist, the hospital, the organization providing the funding, or the CIA. The complicated structure could make responsibility difficult to trace. And that was exactly what made the program so difficult to expose. Another area of research involved hypnosis. The CIA was fascinated by the possibility that hypnotic suggestion might influence behavior or memory. Could a person be persuaded to perform an action? Could memories be altered? Could hypnosis make interrogation more effective? Could it work together with drugs? These questions appeared repeatedly in intelligence research. But again, there was no simple answer. Human psychology was far more complicated than intelligence officials hoped. The mind could be influenced, but it could not simply be programmed like a machine. This is an important distinction. There is no credible evidence that MKUltra created a reliable system capable of turning ordinary people into perfectly controlled assassins. That idea belongs largely to fiction and conspiracy mythology. The real program was more chaotic. Experiments produced unpredictable results. Some techniques failed. Some produced temporary effects. Others caused serious distress. And yet the search continued because the stakes seemed enormous. During the Cold War, intelligence officials feared falling behind. If there was even a possibility that an enemy government had discovered a powerful psychological weapon, they wanted to know about it. That fear created a dangerous mindset. When national security becomes the justification, ethical boundaries can begin to move. Something that would normally be unacceptable can suddenly be described as necessary. A dangerous experiment can become research. A person can become a subject. And suffering can become an acceptable cost of obtaining information. That mindset is one of the most important lessons of MKUltra. The program also demonstrated how vulnerable certain people could be. Prisoners had limited freedom. Patients depended on medical institutions. Military personnel operated under authority. And civilians had no idea that intelligence officers were interested in them. The power imbalance was enormous. The people conducting the research had access to money, laboratories, classified information, and government authority. The subjects often had none of those things. This made informed consent especially important. But in many cases, it was absent. Then came the 1960s. The United States was entering a period of enormous social change. The Vietnam War was becoming increasingly controversial. Protests spread across the country. Young Americans questioned government authority. Journalists began challenging official statements more aggressively. And trust in government institutions began to weaken. Still, MKUltra remained hidden. Then, in 1973, something happened that would dramatically change the story. Many of the program's records were destroyed. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of a large amount of MKUltra documentation. The decision meant that investigators would never be able to see the complete history of the program. But some records survived. And those surviving records were enough to reveal something extraordinary. The program had been far larger than the public could have imagined. There had been dozens of projects. Researchers had been funded through complicated channels. Experiments had involved drugs, psychological techniques, and other methods of influencing behavior. And human beings had sometimes been used without their knowledge. The destruction of the records created another mystery. Why destroy them? Was it simply to protect classified information? Was it to prevent embarrassment? Was it to protect the people involved? Whatever the exact motivations, the result was the same. Evidence disappeared. And when evidence disappears, accountability becomes harder. For victims, that meant something even more painful. They might finally discover that they had been part of a secret experiment, only to learn that many of the documents explaining what happened were gone. The program had already damaged their trust. Now the missing records made the search for answers even harder. But the secrets were no longer completely safe. Congress was beginning to investigate intelligence agencies. In the 1970s, the Senate created the Church Committee to examine possible abuses by American intelligence organizations. The investigation would become one of the most important examinations of intelligence power in American history. And MKUltra was one of the most disturbing subjects to emerge. Americans learned that the CIA had conducted secret research involving psychoactive drugs. They learned that some people had not consented. They learned that records had been destroyed. And they learned that intelligence agencies could operate for years without the public knowing what was happening. The revelations shocked the country. The phrase mind control attracted headlines because it sounded unbelievable. But the truth was more complicated. The CIA had not discovered a magical technique for controlling every human mind. What it had discovered was that drugs, psychological pressure, isolation, and suggestion could produce powerful effects on people. Sometimes those effects were unpredictable. Sometimes they were dangerous. And sometimes they were devastating. The scandal, therefore, became less about science fiction and more about ethics. Who has the right to experiment on another human being? Does national security justify secret experimentation? Can an intelligence agency be trusted to investigate its own actions? And what happens when the evidence is destroyed before the public can see it? These questions would shape the reforms that followed. Congress increased its scrutiny of intelligence agencies. Oversight became more important. Human research standards became increasingly strict. And the idea that government agencies could secretly experiment on citizens without consequences became much harder to defend. But for the people who had already been affected, reforms came too late. Their experiences could not simply be erased. The families of victims still wanted answers. Some never received complete explanations. Some records were gone forever. And some people who may have been involved in experiments never even knew the truth. That is what makes MKUltra so haunting. The program ended, but its consequences did not. And as the public learned more, another question emerged. If the government had been willing to experiment with the human mind during the Cold War, what else had been hidden? That question would lead investigators deeper into the secret world of American intelligence. And the more they discovered, the clearer one uncomfortable truth became. The real danger was not that the CIA had mastered mind control. The real danger was what people were willing to do while trying to discover whether mind control was possible. Part 3. By the 1970s, the secret surrounding MKUltra was beginning to collapse. For years, the program had existed behind classified files, hidden funding, and carefully separated projects. But now, the United States was entering a period when people were questioning the power of their own government. The Vietnam War had damaged public trust. The Watergate scandal had shown that powerful officials could abuse their positions, and journalists were becoming increasingly determined to investigate what was happening behind closed doors. Then came the revelations about the CIA. Investigators discovered that the agency had been involved in activities that most Americans had never imagined. Among them was MKUltra. The surviving documents revealed a disturbing picture. The CIA had funded research into drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and interrogation techniques. Some experiments involved people who had not knowingly agreed to participate, and many of the original records were already gone. The destruction of the files made one question impossible to answer completely. How large was MKUltra really? The surviving evidence suggested that the program had included numerous projects and involved a wide network of researchers and institutions. But because so much documentation had been destroyed, investigators could only reconstruct part of the story. For the victims, this created a painful situation. Imagine discovering decades later that something strange that happened to you may have been connected to a secret government experiment. You want to know what happened. You want to know who authorized it. You want to know what substance was used. You want to know what the researchers recorded. But then you discover that the files are missing. The evidence is gone, and the people who might have known the truth may no longer be alive. That was the reality faced by some people connected to the story. One of the most famous cases remained that of Frank Olson. Olson had been a scientist working with the U.S. Army and had connections to biological warfare research. In 1953, he was secretly given LSD during a gathering involving CIA personnel. He reportedly suffered serious psychological problems afterward. Only days later, Olson fell from a hotel window in New York City and died. His death became one of the most controversial episodes associated with the program. For years, questions remained about exactly what had happened. Was it an accident? Was Olson experiencing a severe psychological crisis? Were there other circumstances that had never been revealed? The complete answer remains disputed. But there is one fact that cannot be ignored. Olson had been given LSD without his knowledge, and his death became a powerful symbol of the risks created when secret experimentation operates without informed consent. Another case involved Harold Blauer. Blauer was receiving treatment at a psychiatric facility in New York. Unknown to him, he was given substances as part of secret government research. He later died. Investigations eventually revealed the connection between his treatment and the government program. These cases demonstrated why informed consent matters. A patient trusts a doctor. A person entering a hospital expects medical treatment to be focused on their well-being. But if that person unknowingly becomes part of a secret experiment, the relationship changes completely. The patient is no longer simply a patient. They have become a research subject without being told. And that is exactly the kind of abuse that modern research ethics is designed to prevent. The revelations surrounding MKUltra, therefore, became more than a CIA scandal. They became part of a much larger debate about human experimentation. Who should be allowed to conduct experiments? What information must participants receive? What risks are acceptable? And who watches the researchers? The answers to these questions helped shape stronger ethical standards in the years that followed. But there was another issue: accountability. The CIA had operated under a culture of secrecy. National security had been used to justify keeping information hidden. But secrecy can create a dangerous environment. When nobody outside the organization can see what is happening, wrongdoing can continue for years. That is why congressional oversight became so important. The Church Committee investigated intelligence agencies and exposed abuses that went far beyond MKUltra. The investigation revealed a broader pattern of activities that had taken place without adequate oversight. For the American public, this was a turning point. The CIA had been created to protect the nation. Now people were asking who was protecting the public from the CIA. That question became central to the debate over intelligence reform. A democracy needs intelligence agencies. Governments need secret information to protect national security. But secrecy cannot mean unlimited power. There must be rules. There must be oversight. There must be consequences when those rules are broken. MKUltra demonstrated what can happen when those protections fail. The scandal also created another problem. Myth. Once the public learned that the CIA had genuinely experimented with drugs and psychological techniques, stories began to grow around it. Books, films, television programs, and eventually the internet turned MKUltra into a symbol of secret government mind control. Some stories claimed that the CIA had created perfectly programmed assassins. Others suggested that famous people had been secretly controlled. Some theories described advanced technologies that were never supported by evidence. The real history was already disturbing, but it was mixed with speculation. And that created a challenge for anyone trying to understand what actually happened. The documented evidence does not show that MKUltra produced perfect mind control. It does not show a reliable technology capable of turning people into programmable robots. Instead, the evidence shows something much more human. The CIA wanted to understand whether human behavior could be manipulated. It experimented with drugs and psychological techniques. It sometimes ignored basic ethical principles. And people suffered because of it. That reality is important because exaggeration can actually weaken the historical truth. You do not need a science fiction story to understand why MKUltra matters. The real story is frightening enough. A government agency believed that national security justified searching for ways to influence the human mind. And during that search, some individuals lost the ability to make informed choices about what was being done to them. That is the real danger. Not perfect mind control, but the willingness to experiment with human freedom. By the time the scandal became public, the Cold War world that had created MKUltra was already changing. The fear of communist brainwashing was no longer enough to justify unlimited secrecy. The public demanded answers. Congress demanded oversight. And intelligence agencies faced a new reality. They could no longer assume that everything classified would remain hidden forever. But the damage could not simply be reversed. Some victims had died. Some families were left with unanswered questions. Some records had been destroyed. And some people may never have known that they had been part of a secret experiment. That is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. A secret experiment can end officially, but its consequences can continue for decades. The story of MKUltra, therefore, became a warning. It showed that fear can push governments toward dangerous decisions. It showed that scientific curiosity can become destructive when ethical boundaries disappear. And it showed that secrecy without accountability can allow powerful institutions to operate beyond the reach of the people they are supposed to serve. But there was still one final question. What did MKUltra leave behind? The program was officially over. The Cold War would eventually end. The laboratories would close. The classified files would become historical documents. But the desire to understand and influence human behavior never disappeared. In the modern world, manipulation does not always require drugs or secret rooms. Information itself can influence people. Advertising can shape decisions. Propaganda can shape beliefs. Technology can track attention. Algorithms can predict behavior. The tools have changed, but the basic question remains the same. How much influence should one person or institution have over another person's mind? That question connects the secret experiments of the Cold War to the world we live in today. And that is why MKUltra remains relevant. It is not simply a story about the CIA. It is a story about power. It is a story about secrecy. And most importantly, it is a story about what can happen when the search for control becomes more important than the freedom of the individual. The program may have ended, but its warning remains. Because technology will continue to evolve. Governments will continue to face threats. Scientists will continue to explore the human brain. And every generation will have to decide where the line should be drawn. Between research and exploitation. Between security and freedom. Between persuasion and manipulation. And between the government's power to protect people and the individual's right to remain free. The story of MKUltra does not really end when the program ends. Because the most important legacy of the program was not a secret drug, a mysterious machine, or a perfect method of controlling the human mind. Its real legacy was a warning. A warning about what can happen when fear becomes more powerful than ethics. During the Cold War, American intelligence officials were terrified that enemy governments might discover ways to manipulate human behavior. That fear pushed them toward increasingly secret research. They wanted answers. Could drugs alter behavior? Could isolation weaken resistance? Could hypnosis influence memory? Could psychological pressure change a person's decisions? But in their search for those answers, they crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. People were sometimes treated as experimental subjects without their knowledge. Powerful substances were secretly administered. Psychological techniques were tested. And because everything happened behind a wall of secrecy, the people responsible could operate for years without public scrutiny. Eventually, the truth began to emerge. The destruction of records made the complete story impossible to reconstruct. But enough evidence survived to show that MKUltra was not a myth. It was real. The program existed. The experiments existed. And the ethical violations were real. Yet there is an important distinction between the historical record and the legends that developed afterward. MKUltra did not give the CIA perfect control over human beings. There is no reliable evidence that the program created an army of programmed assassins capable of receiving secret commands and carrying them out without resistance. There is no proven technology that allowed intelligence officers to completely erase a person's personality and replace it with another. Reality was much less dramatic, and in some ways much more disturbing. The experiments were uncertain. The results were inconsistent. The researchers often did not know exactly what would happen. And real human beings were exposed to those uncertainties. That is the part that should never be forgotten. The people involved were not characters in a spy movie. They were ordinary human beings. They had families. They had memories. They had dreams, and some of them never knew why something had happened to them. For families of victims, the discovery could be devastating. Imagine learning decades later that someone you loved had been unknowingly involved in a government experiment. You might expect the government to provide answers. But what if the documents were destroyed? What if the researchers were dead? What if the agency claimed that it could no longer reconstruct what happened? The truth could remain permanently incomplete. That is one of the consequences of secrecy. Secrecy can protect an operation, but it can also protect mistakes. It can protect misconduct, and it can protect institutions from accountability. That is why the MKUltra story became an important lesson in democratic oversight. Intelligence agencies need secrecy. There is no doubt about that. Governments cannot reveal every intelligence source or every operation. But secrecy must have limits. Someone must be able to investigate what happens behind closed doors. Someone must be able to ask difficult questions. And someone must have the authority to stop an operation when it crosses ethical or legal boundaries. Without oversight, power can become self-protecting. An organization can begin to believe that its mission is more important than the rules surrounding it. That is exactly the kind of environment in which abuses can grow. The revelations of the 1970s therefore led to major changes in how American intelligence agencies were monitored. Congress strengthened its role in intelligence oversight. New expectations developed around human research. The idea of informed consent became increasingly important, and the public became much more skeptical of claims that national security alone could justify secret government actions. But no reform can erase history. The victims remain part of the story. The destroyed records remain part of the story. And the unanswered questions remain part of the story. Perhaps that is why MKUltra continues to fascinate people more than half a century later. It sits at the intersection of science, intelligence, psychology, politics, and fear. It also touches something deeply personal. The human mind is the place where our memories, identity, beliefs, and sense of self exist. To imagine someone trying to manipulate that space is terrifying. But the deeper lesson is not that our minds are helpless. It is that human beings can be influenced in many ways. Fear can influence us. Isolation can influence us. Propaganda can influence us. Social pressure can influence us. Repeated information can influence us. And modern technology has created new ways to study and influence human behavior. That does not mean that today's world is secretly repeating MKUltra. It means that the fundamental ethical questions remain relevant. Who controls the information? Who controls the technology? Who decides what experiments are acceptable? Who protects the individual? And who watches the people with the power to influence millions? These questions matter because technology continues to advance. Artificial intelligence can analyze enormous amounts of information. Digital platforms can study patterns of human behavior. Advertising systems can personalize messages. Neuroscience can reveal more about how the brain works. None of these technologies are automatically evil. But every powerful technology creates ethical questions. The history of MKUltra reminds us that scientific capability must be accompanied by responsibility. Just because something can be done does not mean it should be done. That may be the most important lesson of the entire story. The Cold War created an atmosphere of fear. Fear created urgency. Urgency encouraged experimentation. Secrecy protected the experiments, and the lack of oversight allowed the process to continue. Only later did the public learn what had happened. That pattern can happen in many forms, and history repeatedly shows that institutions are not automatically ethical simply because their stated mission is noble. People inside those institutions still make decisions. They can make mistakes. They can become obsessed with a goal. They can convince themselves that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary actions. That is why ethical limits exist. They are not obstacles to progress. They are protections against the misuse of progress. MKUltra also reminds us that history should be approached carefully. There are still unanswered questions. There are still missing records. There are still claims that cannot be confirmed. So the responsible approach is to separate documented evidence from speculation. The documented story is already powerful. A secret CIA program investigated ways of influencing human behavior. LSD and other techniques were studied. Some experiments involved people without informed consent. The agency used secret funding arrangements. Many records were later destroyed. Congress investigated. The public learned about the program, and the scandal contributed to greater scrutiny of intelligence agencies and human experimentation. That is the history. Everything beyond that requires evidence. And this distinction matters because exaggerating the story can hide the real lesson. The truth does not need to become a conspiracy theory to be disturbing. The actual events demonstrate something very real about power. When an institution becomes powerful enough to operate in secret, accountability becomes essential. When scientific research involves human beings, consent becomes essential. And when national security is used as a justification, independent oversight becomes essential. Without those protections, the line between protection and abuse can become dangerously thin. MKUltra eventually disappeared from the headlines. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. New threats replaced old ones. Generations changed. But the story remained. It survived in government documents. It survived in congressional records. It survived in the memories of victims and their families. And it survived in the questions that historians continue to ask. Perhaps the most important question is not, did the CIA control people's minds? The more important question is, what are powerful institutions willing to do when they believe controlling the human mind might protect national security? That question has no easy answer. But history gives us one clear warning. When fear becomes an excuse for unlimited experimentation, people can become casualties of the search for security. When secrecy becomes an excuse for avoiding accountability, abuses can remain hidden. And when human beings are treated as tools rather than individuals, the consequences can last for generations. MKUltra was officially over. But its lesson remains alive. The human mind is not simply another battlefield. It is where identity lives. It is where memory lives. It is where freedom begins. And perhaps that is why the story of MKUltra still feels so disturbing today. Because the greatest danger was never the discovery of perfect mind control. The greatest danger was the belief that the search for control could justify sacrificing individual freedom. History cannot change what happened, but it can teach us what should never happen again. The files may be incomplete. Some answers may be lost forever. But one lesson remains clear. Power must be questioned. Science must have ethics. Secrets must have oversight. And no government, regardless of how powerful its enemies may be, should ever forget the human beings it claims to protect. Because once the pursuit of security destroys the freedom it was supposed to defend. The question is no longer who won the war. The question becomes, what exactly were we trying to save?